Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Pink Sheet's Pharma Regulatory Podcast. I'm Derek Gingery, a senior writer at the Pink Sheet, and I'm joined by Pink Sheet executive editor Matt Hobbs and senior writer Sarah Carlin Smith. We hope everyone out there is staying safe. We're all excited that today we're experimenting with filming our conversation so that we can present video as well as audio formats. Hi. Comments at our attempted video are always welcome, so long as they don't make fun of our teleworking wardrobes, which we have upgraded. So, first up today is FDA advisory committees. FDA is sort of a problem here because the coronavirus restrictions are preventing large gatherings, and that makes advisory committee meetings much more difficult. But there is talk at the agency now that the meetings could be held virtually if necessary for near-term user fee goals. Committees will be smaller in number and discussions will be limited to a targeted set of issues where FDA needs help. Several advisory committee meetings already have been postponed because of coronavirus, and there may be candidates for a there may be several candidates for a virtual session. So who wants to attend a virtual advisory committee? I'm actually a little excited about this, just because I just want to see how this would work.
Well, there have been advisory committee webcasts in the past. So that's sort of not the feeling that kind of people could sort of kind of dial in isn't without precedent. But the idea that sort of kind of that the people who are supposed to be exchanging ideas wouldn't be in the same room is certainly a challenge that FDA needs to address. Obviously, like from the plans that we've heard about, they're going to be smaller for kind of maybe sort of fewer members and obviously sort of more targeted discussions. So it'll be sort of kind of easier for FDA and the panelists to sort of get to sort of kind of what is most needed.
Well, yeah, it's the discussion that FDA likes the most out of these things, not necessarily votes per se. So the just kind of being able to facilitate that, even there's three of us talking here virtually, and it's discussing things is a little tougher than if you're sitting around a table in a room.
Right. One thing I've noticed in doing lots of Zoom meetings over the past month is that it only works with a large number of people if like one person is in charge and really dictating who's speaking when. And so that will sort of impact the natural flow of a conversation you might have in person versus online. It's going to be the chair of the committee is going to really have to have a lot more control over who speaks and when.
Yeah, to a certain extent, they have to do that in person because they have so many people in the panel, and they kind of just trying to keep it coordinated. But yeah, it's going to be difficult to kind of to have the so-called turn your card sideways type of movement to to get people to figure out who wants to talk, or if you just go around the room and give everyone one shot at giving their comment and then moving on with whatever else you want to do or something like that. It's going to be awkward probably the first couple times they try and do it. So yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the things I noticed though in like reading our coverage was that Bridget did the story about how the timing of the advisory committee doesn't seem to impact approval. So at least in terms of that element of the shift here, people don't necessarily need to be worried that if the scheduling gets pushed because of needing them to be virtual, that it should will have some sort of impact on their application. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that seems like that's a pretty important thing that companies are going to have to at least can feel better about, is that even if it is like within the last couple of weeks before the user fee goal, that it shouldn't dramatically at least upend the review process.
Yeah, that was interesting because that was at least my anecdotal impression had been that sort of an advisory committee is kind of close to the deadline sort of wasn't particularly good news, but I guess it was just sort of either recency bias on my part or just for kind of some particularly searing events for particularly unlucky sponsors that sort of kind of made me think that was a great dive she did into that. She looked at 5 years of data and sort of kind of I think the percentage was sort of kind of maybe there was a 0.5% difference in terms of sort of kind of eventual approval outcome, depending on sort of kind of when the advisory committee was held. So it was very very thorough job that sort of kind of dispelled, or at least a sort of a myth that I had in my head in terms of sort of kind of what makes for a successful advisory committee. So.
Yeah, and we just now got word that one of the advisory committees that was postponed that we thought might actually become a virtual one for Avon and Lilly's imaging drug flirtosapir. That one was actually canceled because FDA said the issues that needed input have been resolved. So that one had been scheduled for April 23rd. So this is something we kind of, I'm sure people are going to wonder if that'll be the reasoning to kind of, not necessarily get around having to schedule 100 of these virtual advisory committees, especially if we're not we don't reach phase 2 or phase 3 of the social distancing guidelines and things in the next few weeks. But it's just a kind of this happens before, but you wonder if this will happen more often now going forward.
Yeah, it's a great question, Derek. As you noted, it's not unique for FDA and the sponsor to figure those things out, but there may be more incentive to do that now that sort of FDA has its hands full with the COVID-19 response and the additional logistical challenge of trying to figure out how to hold a virtual meeting. Sort of kind of could raise the bar, as you said, for sort of kind of what they need to still be wondering about in order to actually hold an advisory committee.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that brings us to the news that Commissioner Hahn made the other day, where he said that user fee performance may slip, because there's so much staff, working on coronavirus type stuff issues. And this goes against kind of what a lot of senior officials had said early on, was that everyone's teleworking, everything is fine, we're kind of moving forward as best we can, and so far things, the workflow seems to be moving as before.
Yeah, I think sort of based on what you and Sarah had been hearing, it seems like sort of kind of an evolution in FDA's thinking. We've obviously talked on this podcast and written a number of stories about how FDA didn't think that telework was going to be a problem. They were already mostly remote because of sort of the staffing crunch at White Oak. Inspections were obviously going to be an issue, but that was sort of kind of a hurdle they would have to face. But just like there seemed to be sort of kind of an exponential growth in coronavirus infections themselves, I imagine sort of FDA is experiencing just a vast increase in the amount of work it has to do on its COVID-19 response. So just as they sort of may have felt they had a handle on their workflow, 2 weeks ago, as more and more applications come in and more challenges are presented on the COVID-19 side, they have to sort of kind of, triage what they're doing elsewhere to deal with the crisis. And it could be that some other deadlines start to slip. So that's what sort of kind of Commissioner Hahn acknowledged yesterday. Yeah.
And it seems like there's like multi levels of their COVID-19 response. Like there's the maybe more obvious thing of the review divisions that would be looking at applications for drugs or biologics for the disease. But then there's all these like secondhand and thirdhand implications of the drug supply chain impacts because of the global economic changes and shortages, changes to inspections and things. So the amount of, this isn't like, I think earlier we have maybe compared this to the government shutdown or times when FDA was had to remove some work off campus and things like that, and that the essential work was going on and they were able to kind of keep things going. But this is going to now sort of seems to be a much different situation because so much attention has to be diverted to things because of this crisis.
Well, and they're moving staff around to handle the big kind of crunch of coronavirus stuff that they're running into, and that's inevitably going to back up on the divisions that don't have coronavirus stuff that's that they have to deal with. So just because you can't, it's a zero-sum game, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, I assume a lot of people probably are guessing that this was eventually going to happen, and are probably, I mean, it may actually be, it's pretty much yeoman's work that they've been able to keep it going this long. I mean, we've been teleworking, almost a month now, at least just about a month. So it's just it's a rough situation for everybody.
Yeah, we heard anecdotal accounts of FDA leadership taking calls with sponsors at very late night on a weekend. So they're obviously sort of working as hard as they can, and just sort of how sustainable is it when you sort of have to do everything you were doing that sort of kind of that was pretty demanding to begin with, and then sort of kind of add on this response to a global pandemic. It's sort of something has to get set aside, as Jenna Woodcock said.
Sure. So next up is another exciting development for patients. The FDA approved the first generic for Merck's Proventil HFA metered dose inhaler. The approval for the product, which is indicated for treatment or prevention of bronchospasm, came in the context of coronavirus, however, creating another one of our kind of famous head-scratching moments. The agency said the application met all the requirements for approval, but when it made the announcement, it said that there was increased demand for albuterol products during the pandemic. So albuterol inhalers are being used now in hospitals for coronavirus patients instead of nebulizers because of concerns that nebulizers could spread the virus in the micro droplets to other patients in the hospital. So now there are concerns that the inhalers will go into shortage nationwide, although there still seems to be enough supply to kind of go around, although you might not be able to find that the brand you particularly like, but you should be able to still get one. So it's a little confusing, but the messaging for the agency here is pretty difficult, just given the circumstances, it seems like.
Yeah, Derek, I think you did some very interesting reporting there, looking at sort of kind of this is a situation in which FDA had sort of kind of changed its product-specific standards for the for the inhalers, or kind of while this application was pending, and that's usually not good news for the sponsor, but in this case, it actually got approved earlier than they were expecting. So maybe they changed it in a positive direction for the shortage region that you were noting.
Yeah, that was an interesting development too, because FDA said that it met all the standards in the new guidance, as which I'm sure it wasn't filed. It was filed under old standards. So but I was told kind of just in talking to people about this, that FDA seems to learn about new things when they're reviewing ANDAs. So it's that can lead to guidance updates and things of that nature. So that could have been what happened at this point, but in this situation. But it's still just kind of an interesting confluence of things that happened.
Commissioner Hahn was actually asked a little bit about this product and other shortages yesterday on a Washington Post interview, and he did make a comment, indicating that they'll expedite products like this when they're any application they have before us that would address a shortage like they're concerned about may be coming with albuterol. So it is hard to know exactly how much that played into it. As you noted in your story, Derek, the application was already supposed to be prioritized because it was a first generic. So it's hard to know how much the current crisis played into that.
Yeah, it could be something that they could have just seized on to the the concerns that people were raising, and just said, hey, this is almost done, let's just finish it. Or it could be just something that looked good in the press release. I mean, who knows at this point. So the final story we have today is our non-coronavirus news, which is an update on interesting FDA legal front story. GSK has forced FDA into a product litigation suit with a citizen's petition that it filed for its Zofran antiemetic product. The petition asks for FDA to review parts of the label related to pregnancy and determine whether changes were needed. But the company is in ongoing litigation over failure to warn of the risk of pregnancy, and the judge in the case has said that the petition response could affect the outcome of the case. So the agency decided to have meetings with both sides. They did listening sessions and things like that. It's this is just an unusual situation, especially since the FDA doesn't get involved in these product liability cases.
Yeah, it certainly would create sort of a new standard and tactic if it were successful for GSK. They would industry would love to see sort of what FDA has determined about an application sort of be what holds up in court. And unfortunately for them, the Supreme Court precedent and everything else has sort of kind of gone the other way in terms of sort of kind of where their liability is set. But if this becomes the something that sort of kind of works out for them, we could see a lot more petitions like this, and sort of essentially sort of perhaps force FDA to be the arbiters of these cases more than the legal system.
It's really odd to me, I guess, the way Brenda mentioned this in her story, that normally the parties involved in a legal suit wouldn't be able to have the kind of interaction that this petition is now allowing them or letting them have. So you have sort of ongoing litigation and yet circumstances going on that could change the litigation. It seems very confusing for the folks involved in the court system who have to handle this as well.
Yeah, I believe, if I'm remembering the story correctly, that the FDA's chief counsel was asked to be deposed in this case, and she refused. So you got to wonder at this point if you're going to see more of those types of situations too, where it's all these suits they either want a meeting with FDA in the middle of it, or if they wanted to start deposing people, and does the agency want to get involved in that, and how are they going to deal with those kinds of requests going forward?
It's certainly not welcome news for FDA to sort of kind of have to have this sort of level of scrutiny and pressure on citizen petitions, given everything else that they've got going on. So if they're able to sort of kind of extricate themselves from circumstances like this, they'll probably be very happy.
Yeah. So, okay, well, that's all we have for this week. For more, check out our website at www.thepinksheet.com. You can also find this and previous podcast episodes on iTunes or SoundCloud by searching for Pharma Intelligence Podcasts. And if you're so inclined, feel free to give us a review. Thanks again for listening or watching to the Pink Sheet's Pharma Regulatory Podcast. I'm Derek Gingery with Sarah Carlin Smith and Matt Hobbs. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.